Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street. I'm delighted to be joined now by Peter McKenna. Peter McKenna is a psychiatrist. He has worked at different times as a clinician and an academic and currently works full-time in research in Barcelona. His research interests are mainly in schizophrenia, and he has published widely on clinical and neuropsychological and more recently neuroimaging aspects of the disorder. He's the author of a previous book on schizophrenia and co-author of a book on the symptom of formal thought disorder. And I'm delighted to be talking to Peter McKenna today about his latest book, the title of which is Delusions, Understanding the Ununderstandable. And this is published by Cambridge University Press. So, Peter, let's start off by describing what a delusion is. Can you give us some examples from your own clinical experience or other delusions that are in the literature?
Yes, sure. Well, I mean, every psychiatrist knows the textbook definition of delusion as a fixed abnormal belief outside the patient's cultural context and so on and so on. What sparked my interest in delusions and other forms of abnormal belief were the fact that these beliefs are really wild sometimes. So, in fact, my interest in delusions is bracketed by two patients I saw very early on in my career, both in the same hospital. And the first was a young man whose mother had brought up to be seen, saying he was in a state of relapse. And at first I was very skeptical because he was calm, well-dressed, pleasant, relaxed. However, as soon as I started questioning him about any possible symptoms, he started explaining matter-of-factly that he'd just taken part in a race to the moon, and also in the race were a soda bath and a water bottle. And I didn't know at the time, but I realised that this was the kind of thing that's normally subsumed under the terms delusional memories, fantastic delusions, and delusional confabulations. So that was one patient. And then at the other extreme was a man I saw with morbid jealousy, or rather a man I was looking after over a considerable period of time. And I'd just completed a course on a structured interview, so I decided to practice on this patient. And I was fully expecting to find evidence of not only of belief that his wife was being unfaithful, but widespread delusions of reference and misinterpretation supporting this. And I was quite shocked that there was nothing. Yes, he was absolutely convinced his wife was being indiscriminately unfaithful all over the place, but no, there was nothing else there. No mood change, no delusions of reference, nothing. And this, after a considerable delay with lots of toing and froing, led me to the literature on overvalued ideas. A second form of abnormal belief, which is, well, at least in my view, and probably is generally accepted to be phenomenologically distinct from delusions. So those were the two extremes. Other cases I've seen, I'll never forget a young man who I was interviewing for transfer to the rehab service I was working in, and he gave an account of a recent experience where his brain had been removed from his body and flown to America in a plane. Then he remembered his brain being put on a wheelchair and taken to a studio where it took part in a recording session with a rap star. And then he described being flown back and his brain being replaced in his body. And one of the reasons this sticks in my mind was because at the end of the interview, he asked me what I thought his diagnosis was, and I tried to say diplomatically as diplomatically as I could that I thought he was suffering from schizophrenia. To which he responded saying, "Just tell me one thing I've said that makes you think I've got schizophrenia."
Right. Okay. So those are some very good examples. Now, the one you mentioned about morbid jealousy, that example is in your book,
Hmm.
and you point out that he did some behaviors like checking his wife's underwear in a, I don't think you necessarily use this word, in an obsessional or
Yeah.
repetitive sense. Now, this is one of the reasons, isn't it? And I put it to you that delusions lie at the heart of psychiatry, as you start off your book talking about delusions, at the heart of the concept of insanity, which is it leads people to do very strange things. Your description of this man checking his wife's underwear felt like a very strange piece of behavior. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my thoughts there are yes and no. Yes, of course, it's clearly irrational behavior with a strong obsessional tint to it. But no, in the sense that I, at least, could imagine myself into that kind of thing. If I was being dominated by a belief which I was absolutely convinced about and was against my interests, then I would probably search for backing, for supporting evidence, which is what the patient was doing. And then, as probably we've all found, if you look for evidence, you find it, or you think you find evidence of it. So I was ultimately unimpressed by that as intrinsically abnormal. It seemed to be a response to his overriding belief. And it was a response that you could empathize with. And you could almost say it was a response you could understand in the sense that Jaspers used it to distinguish delusional beliefs which can't be understood from beliefs which may be very strongly toned and abnormal quantitatively, but lack the ununderstandable quality of delusions.
So I want to come on and ask you a bit about the famous psychiatrist Jaspers and his view of delusions, because you discuss that in the book. But I don't want to leave this case of the morbid jealousy just yet, because I thought in the book you say that he goes on to kill his wife.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
Which was a horrendous outcome. Could you say a bit about that?
Well, people act on their beliefs, but certainly people act on their normal beliefs. People certainly act on overvalued ideas if you believe in that category of psychopathology. But it's something that's drummed into all psychiatrists that surprisingly people with frank delusions often don't act on them. And the example in Fish, as I recall, is the chronically hospitalized patient who believes she's the queen, who's content to scrub the floors in the asylum. So it's one of the peculiarities of delusions is that the belief is not held, as Jasper said, in quite the same way as normal beliefs are.
And this leads on to another idea, which is, to what extent do these patients really believe in their ideas? A lot of people, on hearing your description, or lay people, would think these ideas are so outrageous or bizarre. Either the patient's lying, i.e. making it up, but there's some sense in which they don't really believe this, do they? And isn't that a central question? To what extent do they really believe it? Because one test of genuine belief is whether you act as if you believe it. So if you believe you're God, yet you carry on delivering the post as a postal worker in the Croydon area, then to what extent do you really believe that you're God? And one of the tests is whether the delusion actually leads to behaviors in the real world, whether people act in response to the belief, and that's a key issue, isn't it?
Yes, it's a key issue, but it's unfortunately for most psychiatrists, including me, it's a philosophical issue. There's a increasing literature on the on this question: are delusions beliefs, or are they something that just masquerade as beliefs? And I don't pretend to understand this, but I've dipped into it, and the answer is currently undecided as far as I can tell. So beyond that, all I can say is what Jaspers said, is yes, they really believe it, but no, they don't believe it in exactly quite the same way as you and I believe our everyday beliefs, even our fondest beliefs. There's something very strange about it that no one has pinned down. Perhaps philosophers will.
So let's get to Jaspers. Could you say a bit about who Jaspers was and what his contribution, what he's trying to say, lies at the heart of what a delusion is?
Yes, well, we could talk all night on Jaspers. I'm not particularly familiar with his career. He was Schneider's predecessor in Heidelberg, as I recall. And he was a practicing psychiatrist, but he was also a distinguished philosopher, and he's well known in philosophy. He's not a minor figure. He's an important voice in the 20th century. So he was in a unique position to think about the nature of delusions. And he came up with some fabulous clinical descriptions, and in particular, we owe a lot of our current thinking about delusional mood, delusions of reference, delusions of misinterpretation, and so on, to Jaspers' clear and concise descriptions of patients. He then argued, which is something I took issue with in the book, that the central experience of delusion was a fundamental transformation in the experience of meaning. And when he said experience, he was careful to point out that it's not perceptual experience. Perception is unaltered, but the significance of the perception becomes radically transformed, so that essentially neutral events acquire significance, and it's personal significance. And these days, no one doubts that. The fundamental phenomenological characteristic of referential delusions, including delusional mood, if you want to include that, is this alteration of meaning so that neutral events acquire personal significance. What Jaspers then went on to say was that this alteration of meaning underlies all delusions, not just referential delusions, but somatic or hypochondriacal delusions, grandiose delusions, persecutory delusions, and presumably delusional memories and fantastic delusions. And I took issue with him in the book about this, but it wasn't just me. There was someone who wrote a very good commentary in the British Journal of Psychiatry 25 years ago called Walker, who queried Jaspers, essentially saying, isn't this a step too far? How does it actually work? And to this day, I don't know what Jaspers meant by transformation of meaning underlying what the book calls propositional delusions, which are just delusional beliefs that are not referential, grandiose, persecutory, and so on. How that could involve a transformation in meaning, and it's not very clear.
Okay, but if we unpack that a little bit, to give an example from my own clinical experience, a patient is at a pop concert or a rock concert, and the pop star on stage touches their nose. And this would be seen as an innocuous, irrelevant event by 99.9% of the audience at that rock concert. But suddenly the patient decides that this touching of the nose means something very personally relevant. Like, for example, this means the rock star is in love with the patient. And I'm disguising the details, but this is not a million miles away from cases that I've seen. In other words, the touching of the nose has now meaning, which is very different to the meaning of the rest of us, for the rest of us, and is deeply personally significant. And this loops back to a current, as I understand it, way of thinking about delusions, which you end the book with, which is the salience theory that I'm sure we're going to come on to. But is that what Jaspers is referring? That when the patient now comes and describes that touching of the nose, they will imbue it with meaning, whereby they can't figure out why we can't see, anyone listening to the story, why the touching of the nose clearly and obviously means something beyond just touching of the nose.
Yes, that's exactly what Jaspers said. Where it gets problematic is trying to apply this logic to the belief that, say, a person who believes is Jesus. Does this always mean that he's previously had delusions of reference or misinterpretation? In your example, the pop star touching his nose? And the answer is most people accept, especially Schneider made a big point of this, that no, these delusions just grow. They can appear suddenly or they can grow gradually, but they appear. They're not somehow an explanation of widespread referential delusions. Sometimes they are, and that's particularly the case in persecutory delusions, where in patients with delusional disorder, it's only after months or years of trying to figure out what all this means that the patient comes to the conclusion that he's being persecuted and the persecutor is person X. That definitely sometimes happens, but unfortunately for the theory, it definitely sometimes doesn't happen. And if you doubt me on this, then the question I'd put to you is, well, what about people who don't have schizophrenia but who have other psychotic disorders, in particular mania and depression? Patients with psychotic forms of major depression obviously have delusions, but it's not my impression that these can be traced back to antecedent referential delusions. No, they just start to believe that they're the wickedest woman in the world, or they've committed a crime, or that they're making everyone ill, or whatever it is. So that's, to me, a telling example of that there are delusions which are not comprehensible according to this sequence, which, as you've said, is fundamental to the salience theory of delusions.
Okay, staying with Jaspers still, this notion of ununderstandable seems also important, and you go into this in your book, which is that, again, correct me if I'm wrong, as I understand what is trying to be said here, is that sometimes people can develop a belief and you can understand why they may have that belief, even if the belief is incorrect or impossible or clearly wrong, because you can understand how they may have come to those ideas by tracing back their past history, their past experiences. But as I understand it, this ununderstandable notion of delusions is that they make no sense at all, these beliefs, even when you try to look back into the patient's past and history. Is that what Jaspers is trying to say?
That's what Jaspers is saying. He emphasizes abnormal life experiences, abnormal or traumatic life experiences, as giving rise to abnormal beliefs, and those are the beliefs that are understandable. And I suppose an example which certainly wasn't given by Jaspers, but one I've been reading about recently, is that people who've been attacked, raped, and the perpetrator is being caught and tried, and then months or years later, he's freed on appeal, sometimes with an incontestable DNA evidence. As far as I can tell, the victims characteristically continue to believe that person was responsible. Clearly, it's not a credible belief. It's a false belief. But at the same time, it's eminently understandable, given what's happened to the person. And you see it in the relatives of people who've been murdered. And who wouldn't? So what Jaspers is saying is, no, there's nothing like that in delusions. There's no mortifying life experiences. There's no sequence of more and more intense personal, what he refers to as a personal development, which ends up in a belief which the rest of the population largely won't share. It comes from somewhere else. Now, I have to say, there's a lot more to Jaspers' concept of ununderstandability than the rather banal statement that it doesn't come from anything you can trace it back to. And Jaspers is not very easy to understand on this, but Walker in his 1991 British Journal of Psychiatry article is absolutely crystal clear on what Jaspers meant by ununderstandability.
Okay, but I also wondered if connecting the two themes here, meaning and ununderstandability, that Jaspers is focusing a little bit more on how people develop ideas as the crucial territory in understanding delusions, whereas one of the failures of the current textbook and modern definitions, and the definitions have been going on for quite a while in psychiatry, which is to focus on the content of the idea, i.e. the idea is false, the idea is held strongly in the face of opposing evidence, and so on. And I thought you were hinting at this in your book, that there's an issue about understanding where a delusion comes from, or delusion formation, and defining what a delusion is. And the current emphasis on the content of the ideas, or the falsity of the idea, I got the feeling that you felt there was a problem with that. I wonder if you could say something about that.
Yes, well, I don't need to say anything about it because Jaspers has already said it all. In surprisingly modern terminology, he says something like, the textbook definition of a delusion is a false belief which is held with incomparable subjective certainty and out of keeping with the patient's cultural background. And he said, and he dismisses it in the next paragraph. He says, this is obviously wrong. And he gives perfectly lucid, understandable, non-philosophical examples of why this isn't the case. So the textbook definition is riddled with errors and shortcomings. So, in a sense, the idea of the processes underlying delusions is an effort to get at the nature of them, but given that the definition is not satisfactory.
And I thought you gave a lovely little example of this problem, drawing, I think, from another source, of two people fighting over the dispatch box in Parliament. The Prime Minister, I think, of the day at the time was John Major, and the Leader of the Opposition was Neil Kinnock, but it could be Jeremy Corbyn today and Theresa May, that they will argue with each other vociferously. They will both believe they are right. They'll both believe the other person's completely wrong, and they'll both believe that the other person's wrongness is self-evident, that it's barred or obvious that the other person's wrong. And so the nature of the fight or argument is in a sense both of them believing the other person's delusional. And if you really went with that idea, then every single Prime Minister and every single Leader of the Opposition, going back to when Parliament began, have both been deluded.
Well, that was one of Jaspers' arguments about the fallibility of the textbook definition of delusions. And that example comes from Walker's commentary on Jaspers. And it's very telling. there's obviously something wrong with a definition of delusions that says that the beliefs are false and held with fixed conviction, because many of our beliefs, true and false, are held with fixed conviction. And this is something else that Jaspers dismisses, the idea of fixed conviction.
So I want to go on and talk about overvalued ideas, but I just don't want to leave this key point about the definition, the textbook definition of delusions being wrong in psychiatric textbooks and in major classification systems like the DSM, because I think this is a very important point. There's a sense in which psychiatry, modern day psychiatry, seems very keen on skipping quickly over this issue of what actually is a delusion, to try and label people as having delusions or not having delusions. And they try to do it very fast. Whereas if you try to get into understanding at the deepest level people's belief systems, that's a long process, and it involves asking people lots of questions in an in-depth sense to try to get a sense of what they believe before coming to a view as to what is going on. And it seems like modern psychiatry doesn't want to do that.
Well, as I say somewhere in the book, quoting the introduction to a debate by two associate editors of the British Journal, they say phenomenology is something that seems to have fallen off the psychiatric syllabus in recent years. And it's all too true, as you say. The question is, can we manage without it? And I think there's a good example of the answer to this being no, in the complete knots that DSM from 3 through to 5 has tied itself up in with body dysmorphic disorder. I mean, it's just crazy. You can have non-delusional and delusional forms of BDD, and they're exactly the same, and studies have been done to show that all the demographic characteristics and outcome and so on is exactly the same, but the only thing they differ in is whether they are fully convinced that their appearance is unsightly in some way. And it's obviously ridiculous to chop artificially down the middle what is more likely to be a continuum of conviction. And there's other examples as well. So yes, if you throw phenomenology away, you're really throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and you get into practical difficulties, of which BDD is one.
And when you refer to phenomenology, you're referring to a branch of psychiatry or even philosophy and psychology, which is the attempt to get at exactly what the patient's experiencing, but to do so without bringing any prior theories that you may hold to bear. An attempt to dispassionately dissect exactly what's going on in the patient's experience in the head, but in a pre-theory manner.
Well, I mean, that's Jasper's phenomenology. It's got some kind of deep, complicated link to the branch of philosophy called phenomenology, which someone tried to explain to me once, but I didn't follow. But it's, in its clinical sense, it's exactly as you say, to try and get a theory of the symptom without forcing it into some category that it doesn't really belong, without going too far down the line of, let's say, psychological reasoning or pharmacological reasoning or what have you.
Sorry, go on.
No, whether it's an achievable goal, I don't know.
Okay, now the other important part of the book, and there are many important parts of the book, is to ask when are strange ideas not delusions? I think this is a very important chapter. And you talk a bit about overvalued ideas, and you hint that the understanding what an overvalued idea has fallen a little bit by the wayside, but it's an extremely important branch of psychiatry. And you talk about anorexics anorexia being a disorder where people are convinced they are um, really overweight, when in fact they are painfully and abnormally thin. So could you say a little bit about why that central belief in anorexia is an overvalued idea as opposed to a delusion?
Well, that's easy to answer at one level, is that no one has ever had the temerity to say patients with anorexia are deluded. You have to look very hard in the literature to find examples of that. Because the term delusion has a lot of baggage attached to it, and it has the baggage in particular of psychosis. So no one wants to say girls with anorexia are psychotic. So if it's not, you're in a bit of a quandary. Is it something that's not a delusion? Well, people have made attempts to try and say it's a perceptual problem, and they haven't. Those attempts just didn't go very far. Or it's an obsession. Again, it didn't go very far. So you're left with it that it is. There is an element of abnormal belief, but it's not a delusion because a delusion implies psychosis. And the person who's written most eloquently on this in recent years is someone called David Veal, who argues that anorexia nervosa is an overvalued idea, and it's only one of a quite large class of disorders which are characterized by overvalued ideas.
So what is an overvalued idea?
Well, as a shorthand way of looking at it, it's an idea with exactly the same qualities as passionate normal belief. It's just exaggerated, and it's not. I wouldn't say it's idiosyncratic, but it's unusual in that it's not the kind of thing that people normally become passionate about, which is politics, religion, scientific ideas, and so on. So this is Jaspers again. He said it's absolutely identical. It's just an exaggerated form of the kind of beliefs we all hold. So these overvalued ideas are clearly on a continuum with normal belief, whereas Jaspers said delusions are qualitatively different.
But I think that one of the ways in which they're different is that if you think about anorexics, one of the very interesting things about anorexics is that they walk around wearing very baggy clothes, i.e. attempting to disguise to some extent their actual body shape, or maybe their thinness. There's a sense in which when you speak to anorexics, they stick to their guns over their belief system, but they have some sense of the fact that the rest of the world doesn't share their view about their bodies. And there's a difference there between, and this goes into theory of mind, I think, and you hint at this in the book, a schizophrenic or someone with a delusion who believes they're God and announces to you that they're God doesn't really compute that announcing that you're God to a psychiatrist is not going to lead to anywhere other than treatment or a psychiatric diagnosis. You're not going to be taken to Canterbury Cathedral to claim your rightful place on the throne. And so there's a sense in which people with delusions don't get what's going to happen next as they express their delusional ideas. They don't understand the social impact. Whereas people with anorexia and obsessionals do understand that. I don't know if you agree. That's a key difference.
I would absolutely agree. What's going on, though, behind it is very difficult. Theory of mind as an ingenious, and you can fairly say a much loved theory of delusions. But when I reviewed this in the chapter on psychological theories, my conclusion was it doesn't stand up. Yes, patients with schizophrenia have impaired performance on theory of mind tests, but no, this is not associated with presence of delusions, and that's what most of the evidence points to. So I don't think it's theory of mind exactly, but yes, there's something which is perhaps bound up with theory of mind, which is definitely going on there.
Okay, let's examine, while we're on that subject, some other psychological theories that you review in the book. One of them is this notion of jumping to conclusions, or sometimes abbreviated as JTC. That was a theory that there was the problem with people with delusions. They just jump to conclusions.
Well, it still isn't a theory.
Yeah. So you're very skeptical about this theory.
Well, it's exactly the same. If you look at, yes, there's no doubt that patients with schizophrenia jump to conclusions, show probabilistic reasoning bias in tasks such as the beads task, where you have to decide which of two jars beads are being drawn from. Yes, the evidence that patients with schizophrenia have a problem with jumping to conclusions is very clear, but the correlation with delusion scores is not significant. And this was very clearly illustrated in a very big study from the Institute of Psychiatry, on which one of the authors was the originator of a theory of jumping to conclusions. And this had 270 something patients with psychosis, and the correlation with delusion scores was insignificant.
So just before we leave the jumping to conclusions theory, the bead experiment, just to describe that, would be something like there's a certain number of black beads and a certain number of white beads in a jar, and the ratio may be overwhelmingly in favor of black beads, like there may be 4 black beads to every 1 white bead or something like that ratio. Mm-hmm. You start drawing beads from the jar. At what point, how many black beads do you have to draw, or white beads, before you start drawing conclusions about what the ratio is of the actual jar? And the theory is, if you jump to conclusions, you think you know what's in the jar more rapidly than other people who are being a bit more cautious, that they need to see more data in terms of the number of beads drawn before coming to a conclusion about what the actual ratio is in the jar. Is that a fair description of the experiment?
Yes, to put it more simply, a good proportion of patients with schizophrenia will declare that they know which jar the bead is being drawn from after just one trial, after being shown one bead.
Right, okay. But so there's a sense in which there is some, like with all these theories, there's a sense in which they're getting at some aspect of delusions, but when you try to empirically bottom it out, the theory doesn't really fully stand up in terms of jumping to conclusions and the link with delusions.
Well, I'd put it a bit more strongly than that. It's intuitively related to delusions. These patients come to conclusions more quickly. Well, that's just what patients with delusions do. But there's also another possible explanation, which is that these patients are just cognitively impaired, which is now well recognized in schizophrenia. And there's a growing amount of evidence that that's what's going on. There's a study also done in the Institute of Psychiatry on patients with frontal lobe lesions, and they also showed jumping to conclusions, but such patients aren't usually deluded. And in the last year, a study from Barcelona, not my hospital, but actually the hospital next door, looked at the correlations. It's another big sample, 100 plus, and it looked at the correlations not with delusions, but with neuropsychological impairment, and it found highly significant associations. So my feeling about jumping to conclusions is that it's not something that underlies delusions. It's a manifestation of schizophrenic cognitive impairment. And it may be it's a strange manifestation with peculiar features, and it's may have some commonalities with executive impairment, but it's not probably, it has its own unique features as well. But this isn't delusions, this is something else. But that's just my theory.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the biochemical and neurochemical theories of delusions that you mentioned in the book. Let's talk a little bit about the famous dopamine hypothesis. So what is dopamine, and where do you find it in the brain, and why do people think it's linked to delusions?
Yes. Well, first of all, with neurochemical approaches to delusions, you are wading into a minefield. It's relatively simple with dopamine. Dopamine is thought to be increased in schizophrenia, pathologically increased based on very strong circumstantial evidence and more than a little direct evidence, though it's not considered proven. So, if it's pathological, it's almost certainly related to positive symptoms like delusions and hallucinations. So how could it relate to delusions? Well, there's been various theories over the years, but these theories have been rather overtaken by the conclusive demonstration in the 1990s that what dopamine does, or at least one of the roles of dopamine in the brain, is to provide a reward prediction error signal. And what's a reward prediction error signal? Well, it's the way the organism achieves classical conditioning, learning, reward-based learning. That to make this work, you have to have something rather more complicated than just stimulus response reinforcement. There has to be a mathematical calculation into the relationship between the current reward and previous rewards, and that reward prediction error is just a way of capturing that. So, to keep it simple, dopamine is involved in the learning aspects of reward. It may also be involved in the motivational aspects of reward, and there's what some theorists believe that it's not involved in learning, it's only involved in motivation. But the mainstream view is that it underlies reward prediction error, which is a learning phenomenon. So can this be related to delusions? Well, it can be via Kshitij Kapoor, who in 2003 argued that that if you have pathologically overactive and what was the word he used, disrupted reward prediction error, you will get essentially referentiality, delusions of reference, well, he said delusional mood, but it can easily be extended to delusions of reference. If events that aren't associated with reward start to be perceived as associated with reward, then the subjective correlate of that is that the person will start seeing significance in neutral events. And so that it's a very exciting theory. The question is it right? And then you come on to the salience theory and the testing of it. So that's dopamine. It gives a nice, neat, phenomenologically precise explanation of what Kapoor would call delusional mood, but I would say more broadly is the phenomenon of referentiality. And I wouldn't say that's a big difference.
So let's just talk a little bit about the salience theory. And so it seems to me that what's being said here is that if you've got too much dopamine on board or overactivity of dopamine in certain parts of the brain, at this famous rock concert, you see the rock star touch their nose, and that is imbued with special meaning. It suddenly becomes very salient. It suddenly stands out of all the different things going on stage or at that concert. Suddenly the nose thing stands out to you as being very, very important. At the beginning bit, you may not know why it's important. So you just start locking onto that and thinking very hard about it. And maybe a little bit later, a delusion arrives to explain why that the nose touching event is so extraordinarily salient. But dopamine is telling us what to pay attention to and what you can safely ignore in the environment around you.
Well, yes. I mean, there's various flavors of the of salience and reward prediction error. As applied to psychosis, yes, one is it's making them more important. Another, which I'm more inclined towards, is that it's making them significant to you in the sense of they're predicting important events, which in animals would be, let's say, food reward or other forms of reward, but in humans becomes more complicated. So it's not just that the neutral stimuli become attention grabbing, it's that they become immediately personally significant in a way which you can't argue with.
And one of the really interesting things about that is it does to some extent explain why. You see, the interesting thing about delusions, in my opinion, is not just that people arrive with the idea, but they hang on to the idea. Many strange ideas may arrive in our heads at any one moment in time or throughout the day. But what's interesting about delusional thinking or psychiatric disorder is that people stick with the idea, and they do so in the face of the fact the idea is landing them in trouble. So there seems to be something implicitly rewarding about hanging on to the idea, despite the fact that their lives are spiraling into an abyss as a result of the idea.
Yes, it's unquestionable to them. It's not that they can debate with themselves and conclude that actually they are right after all. It's just there's no question. I am Jesus, I am a rock star, whatever.
And this is also very important because in a way it goes back to a very thorny issue about responsibility. The very fact they're unable, as it were, to oppose the idea means that maybe they're not fully responsible for their actions afterwards because they're in the grip of an illness.
Yes, yeah. Well, that goes to the heart of forensic psychiatry, I would imagine.
Yeah, yes. But I think it's a battle that psychiatry has with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world, as you could see in many famous cases, like going back to the Yorkshire Ripper or Anders Breivik, the Norwegian mass killer, has real difficulty with this notion that the patient is stuck with a delusional idea and is not in a position to question the idea in the way the rest of us are.
Well, as it happens, there's an American forensic psychiatrist who's written a couple of papers now arguing that Anders Breivik, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was not deluded, and he had something which was more akin to an overvalued idea. And he makes a very persuasive case, but I've also read the book on Anders Breivik. There's 2 or 3 books written, one of which is very psychiatrically detailed. And there's some things which aren't really very well captured by this hypothesis. But it's an arguable case that this person was not deluded, but was in the grip of what this author calls, I can't remember, something like overwhelming, violent, overvalued idea or something along those lines. But however, to come back to delusions, yes, it's well, what can we say that goes beyond what's already been said about the phenomenon of acting on delusions and being not responsible for one's actions?
Now, another thing that you do in the book is you discuss the literature and the survey literature on the prevalence of delusions, or at least strange thinking or strange ideas in the population. And there is an issue here, which is it may be that the kind of people that land up in the clutches of psychiatrists with diagnoses of delusions may not be that different from large numbers of the population who don't end up in the grip of psychiatrists. Because I think you hint at that issue in terms of some of the surveys that you report.
Yes, well, one of the most influential theories of schizophrenia at the moment, due almost single-handedly to Jim van Os from Holland and the Institute, is that not only schizophrenia is on a spectrum with normality, and as part and parcel of that, delusions are on a spectrum with abnormal beliefs, which otherwise perfectly reasonable people hold. We're not talking about people with schizotypal personality disorder. We're talking about the man on the street. And it's just a continuum. So I suppose he would probably say something like, most people have one or two that aren't distressing. Some people have one or two that are distressing, or alternatively have a lot of ideas which aren't distressing but tend to become noticeable. And beyond that, at some point, psychiatry artificially draws a line and says this is psychosis. And it's a persuasive theory in some ways.
But what it seems to be saying is that there's a mystery as to why some people end up in the clutches of psychiatrists and why other people who might have exactly the same kind of ideas don't.
Well, yes, it's a mystery, but from the large amounts of research that Van Os has done on this field, he's got an answer to some of that. And some of it is to do with whether it's distressing to the patient or disruptive in society. And others are to do with trauma, childhood trauma, drugs, social difficulties in adolescence, which can cause these ideas to become more to the foreground and lead the individual to seek help and become diagnosed psychiatrically. I mean, it's an interesting theory, and there's undoubtedly something to it, but I'm not sure I'm a adherent to the idea of a continuum of psychosis in the first place. But then that's another story.
Well, it's been fascinating talking to you, Peter McKenna. I just want to conclude with one final question, which is that there's a sense in which if you go into delusions in great detail, and that none of the theories, as I think one of the things your book is trying to say, none of the current theories really capture properly what delusions are. And there's a sense in which delusions are actually more interesting than any of the theories do them the correct service. All the current theories do them a disservice in terms of not capturing what's really interesting about delusions. Now, because I'm a little bit in the Jim Van Os camp, I've met many patients who've had clearly delusional ideas, according to the definitions, but I've not offered them any treatment because I didn't think the ideas were causing them any suffering. It wasn't disrupting their lives, and it wasn't going to disrupt anyone else's life. So I didn't see the need to pursue them in terms of treatment. I like to follow them up, and they would come in believing they were having an interesting chat with me, and but I thought it was useful to keep an eye on them. But I wondered what your thoughts are about that, because I did think that your sense is you find delusions interesting, but you don't necessarily think they all needed treatment.
Well, the book is completely agnostic on this. It doesn't touch on treatment at all.
Yeah.
But I'm very sympathetic to what you say, and the chapter on delusional disorder is notable for this kind of phenomenon. Writing this book, I learned a lot about delusional disorder, and these people are very odd indeed. You know, the beliefs can just go away. They can be there for months, maybe years, and then fade away, especially if they move, and then come back if they go back into the situation which triggered it in the first place. Some of them, despite continuing to have what are clearly delusions, lead a normal and fulfilling life. So yes, there's something very strange going on there, and probably the right place to look is patients with delusional disorder.
So if I read you correctly, because I thought it was very interesting the book was so agnostic on treatment, you would meet your patients yourself who you thought were definitely delusional, but you didn't feel that it was necessary, that it logically followed they required psychiatric intervention or treatment.
Well, if someone is schizophrenic, I follow the herd in saying they need treatment. But on the fringes, you see people who it's not clear. And I suppose about half, maybe more of these people fall into the category of delusional disorder. And do they need treatment? Well, probably a majority of them need treatment sometimes. I mean, they don't take treatment. Anyone who's tried to manage people with delusional disorder will know that they stop treatment all the time. And some of them seem to get on okay, but it can come back.
Okay. Peter McKenna, thank you very much indeed. The book is called Delusions, Understanding the Ununderstandable. It's very readable and gives a very clear account, and is probably the most up-to-date account of the current thinking of delusions that's available in book form at the moment, published by Cambridge University Press and written by Peter McKenna. Peter, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.